Hi, this video is part of my practice for a presentation that I have this afternoon, and the topic is emerging strategies, powerlifting programming by reactive training systems. So just a brief outline of the method. So you're going to start by designing a single microcycle with the goal of improving 1 rep max strength. You're going to repeat this exact same stimulus every week. You're going to track progression closely from week to week, and then you continue until the athlete stops making progress. And then in the process, you're going to evaluate how effective the training variables you've used are, such as the exercises, the sets, the reps, and the intensities. And then you're going to learn more about what the athlete responds best to. And this is going to allow you to repeat the process with more information and build up a picture of how the athlete responds. So you start with a development block. So you develop a training microcycle, which usually is a week, although not always. And you're combining all your knowledge of the athlete and your experience as a coach to draw from your programming toolbox and create the best program that you can. But you're not going to make any changes from week to week. It's the same exercises, same sets, same reps, and the same intensities. The only thing that's going to fluctuate is the load on the bar, depending on if the athlete gets stronger or if they're less prepared and maybe they lift less weight. And you're going to monitor progress each week. And usually this is going to be from like the heaviest top sets combined with RPE, so how many reps away from failure, and from that you're going to estimate their 1 rep max. And you keep repeating this as long as the athlete continues to make progress. And once your athlete has reached peak performance, development block is finished, as any future training is going to lead to reductions in performance. So the first time we do a development block, we want to find the time to peak. So the time to peak is the amount of time that the athlete takes to reach peak performance, and before they become like over adapted to the training stimulus or over fatigued. So we're going to continue to repeat the process even if performance has decreased for a week or two. And the reason being is that some athletes are going to decline in performance, but then they're going to see a predictable upshoot. So we want to make sure that we're not missing that. And according to RTS, the time to peak is similar for all the lifts and throughout a lifter's training career. And development blocks are always going to be the same length, because this means we're going to get the most out of them, especially pre-competition. And if an athlete becomes injured, they would begin a new development block as the cycle has been broken. So fatigue monitoring is very important to emerging strategies. They have an interesting concept of the training stress index, which is their way of measuring volume, but it's not just with the amount of sets. They're also taking into account the amount of reps that are performed and the proximity to failure. And they also use like subjective questionnaires. At the end of every development block, you're going to do a block review. So you're basically going to evaluate how estimated 1 rep max has progressed from start to finish, and where it's peaked. And then you're going to look at what exercises, what training frequency, rep ranges, and intensities you've used. And that's going to try and give you a picture of what's effective. So if we look at this graph here, you can see that the squat and the bench press have gone well. So we'd be looking at kind of what has the athlete done. This indicates that it's effective for the athlete, whereas the deadlift hasn't performed so well. So we'd be looking at what the athlete's done there. So you need multiple blocks of information before you can really make firm conclusions. So because sometimes the athlete might respond better at a later point. So there's 2 types of development blocks. So the first one is focus, and this is when you're increasing 1 rep max using variables that you know are effective. Generally, you're making small adjustments, and you're going to do this when you know the athlete well, when training has been successful, or before competition. And the other type is exploratory. So the goal is also to increase 1 rep max, but you're also testing out new variables, and generally you're going to make larger changes. You do this when you're learning more about the athlete, or if progress hasn't been going so well recently, or in the off season away from competition. When development block's finished, the athlete moves into a pivot block. So this is approximately a third of the length of a development block, and you're going to make significant changes to the program. And basically the goals are to deload the athlete, to give them recovery physically and mentally, allow them to resensitize to the training stimulus. And also there's going to be a bit of general physical preparation. So we're going to work on neglected movements and energy systems that we might not be able to put so much work in on development cycles. So before competition, the block before training is the greatest hit. So this is all the most effective protocols. And the block before that is the tribute band. This is the next most effective. And the taper before competition for emerging strategies is very minimal. So basically you're just going to train normally and you're just going to take maybe 2 or 3 days rest before competition. And the reason being is that this method predicts peak performance at a certain point. So technically we don't need to do anything different, but it does lose out on any potential advantages from overreaching, tapering and super compensation. So emerging strategies is a style of like bottom-up programming. So we're basically trying to follow the athlete's response, find out what's best for that athlete, and then keep doing it. So this contrasts with top-down periodization models, and emerging strategies kind of highlight some issues that some of these are, the research into it is limited by the duration of the study, and some of the success stories could just be due to huge talent pools, and they might not be best for every single athlete. So let's get into some of the positives. So what I really like is the way that emerging strategies tries to measure progression consistently. So we're trying to quantify the progress, we're eliminating guesswork, and we're not just waiting for like a testing day or competition to see how the athlete's performing. So we can kind of validate and say, look, you're progressing very well throughout this block, and it avoids some of the complications because our strength can fluctuate a lot day by day based on many factors. Even looking at our phone for half an hour has been shown to make us weaker, and it avoids that sometimes we might compare good days against bad days. So it's a bit more consistent and it allows us to test if the program is working or not. The other thing that I really like is how we're following the individual response. So we're trying to use quantifiable progress to assess the response. And by keeping the stimulus constant for the duration of the development block, there's less noise, there's less variation, and we can be a bit more certain of what's having an effect. Whereas if we're changing the variables a lot, we don't know what's effective. And when we find effective variables, we work out from there. So an example is if an athlete responds well to pull squats, then they might respond well to box squats or pin squats. And if they respond well to sets of 4, then they probably respond well to sets of 3 and sets of 5. So we're trying to work out from there. And I think all programs are going to do this to an extent, but we're trying to minimize the guesswork compared with other styles. So some factors that I think have both advantages and disadvantages. The firstly will be RPE. So RPE, rating of perceived exertion, is absolutely crucial to emerging strategies. So if the athlete gets it right, they're going to choose the right weights and progress is going to be tracked accurately. So some of the advantages of RPE is it allows adjustments for improvements in performance and fatigue, and generally this is going to lead to high quality of work due to less training to failure, and it allows the athlete to push when they feel good. There's a strong correlation with actual intensity and barbell velocity, and the evidence shows that this style of training is at least as effective, if not more so, than percentage style. Some of the weaknesses are that RPE is quite subjective, so it's not always accurate. And sometimes there might be like wishful thinking, or maybe the athlete has already planned some progression in their head because they're used to that kind of model. So, and they might kind of kid themselves for how strong they are or how difficult the set was. It can be a bit frustrating because because when you're logging and tracking RPE, it can be a bit sort of repetitive. And if you want an accurate stress index, you need RPE for every single set that athlete does. Can get a bit monotonous if we always are asking our athletes to rate RPE. Good quality data is really important. So the athlete has to remain like objective, and we've got to avoid like cognitive dissonance. So usually an athlete wants a development block to be successful, but they have to be careful that they don't kind of kid themselves and just progress the weights when the evidence isn't there. And there's external factors that can have quite a big impact. So if an athlete isn't sleeping well, or nutrition is bad, there's external stress, motivation is low, then that's going to affect the quality of the training block. So that kind of leads into the next point. So there has to be high coach and athlete engagement. So the communication has to be really good. We need the athlete to be logging all workouts, and they've got to be quite patient. And the coach has to closely observe how the athlete is responding, and they've got to be quite self-critical of their own programming. The coach also needs to use software or technology to detect the trends and patterns. And emerging strategies, it obviously works only for individuals. It's not going to work if you're programming for teams. The style of programming is very flexible, so there's infinite variety, so there's a lot of freedom to be creative. There's lots of information to help guide our decisions, and it's probably a system that is going to be easier to change program if necessary, because if a coach has invested a lot of time writing long training programs, then they might be a bit biased and less likely to want to change course if the athlete needs it. The disadvantage of this is there's less structure to rely on, and there can be overload of information, so we have to kind of narrow things down into what's most important. Some of the negatives include the lack of weekly periodization. So emerging strategies presents the exact same stimulus throughout the mesocycle. So we miss out on the opportunity to do introduction weeks where we may be starting with a lower stimulus to let the athlete adapt or take advantage of minimal effective volume. And we can't generate momentum by increasing intensity throughout the block unless the athlete is genuinely getting stronger. And the evidence probably indicates that adjusting intensity and volume from week to week is superior, although as I mentioned earlier, some of this is limited by it's generally 2 to 3 months, which is not a long term in an athlete's career. Progress is probably going to be quite slow initially, or maybe at least slower. And I think part of this is a business decision. So if the athletes need to stay coaching for a long time to kind of reveal the trends, it's going to take a long time before they've really explored all the variables that might be effective for them. So it can take a long time, and there maybe isn't the same focus on long-term strategy. It's more like kind of you're just putting one foot in front of the other, which I don't think is always a bad thing. So there's less focus on secondary and tertiary adaptation. So sometimes the athlete might benefit from focusing on hypertrophy, rehabilitation, or making technical changes, and these might not immediately show up in increases in 1 rep max. And so to summarize, I think emerging strategies is clearly effective, but we shouldn't just copy it. Just like I don't think we should copy any training program. So we can adopt the things that we like. So for me, that's going to be measuring the progress consistently week to week and trying to systemize how we evaluate the athlete's response. And maybe we can add adjustments in the training stimulus from week to week, and maybe a little bit more long-term planning. So sprinkle a little bit of block periodization in there. And just to note that RTS are prepared to program outside of their framework when needed, so they're not dogmatic, and they have a course on emerging strategies. I haven't done the course. I've pieced this together through YouTube videos and articles. And I'm just going to leave with the founder of Emerging Strategies, Anatoly Bondarchuk. So he's one of the most successful throwing coaches of all time, and the genesis of the system starts with him. And this just shows that this program, the system, is not just for powerlifting, but it can be applied to almost any sport. Okay, thank you so much.